Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Dr. Darnise's House of Religion, Magic, and Conjure. Hope you all are doing well in these interesting times. Well, I wanted to come on in this Easter season to talk about Easter, but not in the traditional kind of way. Easter is considered to be the high holy day of Christianity, along with Christmas, because you've got to have the birth of the God, right? Um, but Easter is the highest day for Christians because, like Paul said in the Bible, if Christ be not risen, then our faith be in vain. So Easter's pretty important. But then when you think about what are the components of Easter, you realize that this is a um, a religion that has been syncretized or put together and mixed together from other people's traditions, which is okay, really. I talked to y'all about what is pagan, and that it's not bad to say something is pagan. It just is descriptive rather than diminishing or dismissing or being derogatory about somebody's religion. If you say it's pagan, it's just descriptive, and we have to really get that. We have to really learn that, so we're not fighting as human communities, fighting each other about religion all the time. So anyway, this video is about Easter and the Jesus story, really, and how it's rooted in so many traditions, namely the African, right? And I've talked about that in another video when I've talked about the story of Ausar, Auset, and Heru, otherwise known as Osiris, Isis, and Horus, with their Greek names. But really, when you think about the Jesus story itself, it contains, okay, the African, which most people don't acknowledge, but we do here, obviously. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as kind of a reminder. So we've got the African, and we've got obviously the Jewish, including Passover. We've got astrology, and we've got the European pagan fertility rituals, basically wrapped up in this thing called Easter. So there's so many cultural components to this thing called Easter that it's it's really hypocritical for some Christians anyway to act as if their religion is pure and that other people's religions are not pure, therefore pagan in that derogatory sense, right? And so really that's my point in this video, is to say, you know what, you can't be hypocritical. I mean, if you're going to talk about other people's religions in this way, you are being hypocritical, because your holiest day, commemorated by Easter, is full of other people's spiritualities, right? So let's break this down a little bit. The African we talked about, right? Asar, let me know how the story goes. Asar, Auset, and Heru. We've got the god Asar / Osiris, and we've got Auset / Isis. And what we find, how the story goes, right, is that Osiris is killed by his brother, Set, his jealous brother. And he is dismembered, his body is dismembered, and his parts are scattered. Auset, or Isis, out of her love for her husband, goes to find him and put his dismembered body back together. And so in a way, she resurrects the dying god. The god has been killed. The god has died. He is resurrected in a sense when Isis puts him back together. And she uses his phallus to impregnate herself. So here's a special birth, right? A supernatural pregnancy and a supernatural birth of now the son of God is Heru, aka Horus, right? So the son of God is born through supernatural means, and he is going to avenge avenge his father's death, which means he has to seek out his uncle Set, who was his father's killer, right? So then the story goes on in that way for the Egyptians and the Khemet. Remember, this comes out of Kemet, also out of Kemet. Anyway, so that's where we get this story of a dying God, a immaculate conception, a resurrecting God, and a special divine child, right? So Horus, or Heru is the baby, right? So we have the image of Mary and her baby, or Isis and her baby Horus, Auset and the baby Heru. That image has gone around the world in art, since the beginning of European artistry, right? That image has gone around the world. The Madonna and Child, it has its own genre, it has its own name, the Madonna and Child, and it's normally given to us as that's Mary and Jesus. Well, that's rooted in Auset and Heru. All right, so that's where we get this idea of a dying God, a resurrecting God, a special child, right? A divine child who now has to save the world from his evil uncle Set. He has to save the world, right? Y'all get it. So the next thing I would just say is, as far as this Easter holiday, is the European influence, the pagan European influence. So we already got the basis is that this is an African story. And as Christianity began to take shape, let's say, it incorporated the traditions of other places and people as it spread, right? Up out of the Middle East, Africa, but the Middle East as we know it today, up out of that context and spreading through Europe, who do they run into? European people with their own particular cultural practices, which we then say, oh, those are pagan people. Well, pagan just meant they had their own religion and that they were observing nature. People say they were worshiping nature, but no, they weren't really worshiping nature. They were observant of it. They were in time with it. They were in tune with it, like Africans were as well, right? Recognizing the cycles of nature. And so we have European pagan culture that is a combination of Anglo-Saxon, which is really Germanic, and what we later will call English, the Germans and the English. Their goddess of fertility, who was called Oestre, sort of like Easter, the word Easter, or the name Esther, but it's more Oestre. So if you want to look that up, it's Eostre, Eostre, Esther. And again, that's a Germanic, English, Old World name, so the Anglo-Saxon. And she was a fertility goddess. And so every spring, they would acknowledge that spring is back, right? We've come out of the sort of the darkness of winter, where all of nature kind of went to sleep or maybe appeared to be dead, right? And now in the spring, nature is revived. Nature is resuscitated. Nature is resurrected, right? And so in honor of their own goddess of the resurrection of spring, they would have sacrifices, they would have festivals, they would have parties, basically, of course. This is a something to be commemorated with joy and happiness, because now the crops are growing again, the animals are making babies, spring is alive, nature is giving us her bounty once again, and so it was celebrated, right? And so even this tradition of Easter eggs and rabbits. Eggs are a sign of fertility, right? Rabbits are a symbol of fertility because they're so fertile. So these traditions were about fertility. Well, what these early Christians were not able to do, they were not able to stamp out people's own traditions. No matter how much they tried, no matter how much they threatened, they could not keep people from practicing their own religions. That just doesn't happen. And which is, again, why I always say there's no such thing as pure religion. Religion is always mixed with culture. Whatever your culture, you'll always find the people's own folk religion mixed in with even the institutional religion like Christianity. So that's what they did. They just mixed it all together. You know, the early Christians said, well, since we can't really make them stop doing it, this is the early Christian, like 8th century by the time we get to this pagan Easter festival. Since we can't really get them to stop doing it, let's see if we can mix together. Let's see if we can put Jesus on top. I always call it that. Let's just put Jesus on top. Let's just pour Jesus in the mixture. Since they are talking about the resurrection of nature, why don't we use that to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, the risen Christ? So we will mix in our God with their tradition. And so over time, really since the 8th century, European Christianity, which has spread out across the world, recognizes this thing called Easter. But what are the roots of it? It comes out of this African story about a dying and rising God, a divine child conceived immaculately or in a supernatural kind of a way, and good versus evil, right? Because Set, S-E-T, is the African god, or the brother of God, who is jealous of his brother, Ausar or Osiris. And so they are at odds, they are adversaries. And so you think about that in a Christian context and you go, oh, well, then that's Jesus and Lucifer, two brothers who are adversarial, or at least one is adversarial to the other. And so the story is African at its base, and then you pour in the European fertility ritual, and then you also pour in some old Mesopotamian, Sumerian, Akkadian, see what else are the regional goddesses of Astarte and Ishtar, and you still have images of fertility goddesses. So if some of you are familiar with the Bible and the Old Testament, there are stories for the Jewish people to not participate in Astarte rituals. She's actually named in the Old Testament Astarte because that was, or Asherah, they would call her an Asherah. And it's named in the Bible because people were practicing those rituals towards those goddesses. And so, of course, in the Bible, it's telling those Jewish people don't participate in those rituals because they were very strong rituals. They were very prevalent rituals. And so, again, what you're seeing is the mixture of culture all across time, which is why I think it's so important to not be turned off by the term pagan, because that just really tells us about the different religions and cultures of people all around the world. And we want our religion and our cultures to be respected. And so in enlarging our understanding about the whole world context, the whole global context in terms of religion and culture, you're like, oh, well, people have always done this, and people will continue to always do it, regardless of the fact that some people want to say that their religion is pure and everybody else's is pagan or wrong or bad or demonic. Those of us who are practicing things like hoodoo or any of the ATRs, the African traditional religions, are used to being on that end of the stick, right? We're used to being marginalized and told our religions are not religions and that they're whatever, evil and devil worship or something. I always want to say we ain't got no devil, but from other perspectives that are narrow and misinformed severely, it seems that our religions, aren't spiritualities, only theirs are. So I just want to take this opportunity on Easter of all days to talk about pagan Christianity and why that's typical, why pagan is typical of religion, and to remind us that at the very basis of this story, this Jesus story, is the African, right? Oh, and I mentioned astrology too. You might say, how is astrology in the Jesus story? How did those wise men find Jesus? I know you know the story, right? There was a star in the sky, and they followed the stars, right? So people will think about, oh, astrology is, whatever, dismissing it, right? But when you look into the Bible, a text that's considered to be, authoritative directly from God for a powerful religion, really 3 religions come out of that book, come out of the Old Testament and Abraham as a patriarch, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all come out of that book. Maybe I'll do a video about that, about how we are people of the book. Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And so that text is supremely important. And so when you have these people who are following the stars, and then you find in the New Testament, now that's applied to finding Jesus, right? There are people named in the Old Testament who were known for that. They were good at that. They were called the Chaldeans. And people were warned against them. Don't go see the Chaldeans because they are practicers of magic and astrology, right? But then in the New Testament, but apparently it's good because that's how the wise men find Jesus. So again, the Jesus story is a complex one, and for a number of reasons. This Easter story is complex, and I have to say I really love it as a religious scholar. I really love being able to talk about the combinations of things, right? Hoodoo is a combination of things. It is African American folk magic. It's African American spirituality with remnants of, right? Remnants of the African in this new context called the United States, in which we had to use something to save ourselves, right? So I always think it's a beautiful thing. Anyway, leave me some comments if you have something to say about all this. People ask every season, every Easter season, why are there the Easter eggs? What does that have to do with the resurrection? What does that have to do? What about? Well, it's fertility rituals, y'all. Really, fertility rituals combined with the idea of a dying and rising God. So anyway, leave comments, like, share, support. Pass it along during this Easter season, maybe to people who need to know. You feel like, they could learn a little something. I would love that. Don't forget that we have the Patreon community, and so I'd love to have you over there where I continue to make new content, expanded content for those house members who are joining me on Patreon. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I will be back on with something else pretty soon. All right, bye for now.